Nevertheless, his scholarship and track record indicate that he has been a thorn in the side of those who need thorns in their side.
Times where police intervene in my academic.
That he has done a remarkable job for our people, especially here in Lethbridge. And for this reason, we want to provide him with a Blackfoot name.
The at least 1.3 million dead Arabs and Muslims are testament to the genocidal effect of what Professor Hall calls the fraudulent global war on terror, which was...
And to put the history of this encounter between indigenous peoples, especially in North America, but throughout the Americas, at the heart and soul of a much larger story, a story of globalization. Terror. It was very clear to me that the origins of the global war on terror really go back to those founding events that resulted in the emergence of the United States from the British Empire.
Passionate critic of injustice. One of the things that should always come out about Tony is that he's an outstanding scholar. And anyone who has read his books, and the 2 volumes in particular that are on display today, know that that praise is well deserved. These are major works. This is not fluff. These are major contributions that will have a lasting impression on the field. When I walk into chapters, as I do, I see that book on the shelf. I don't know, I think that says something. A lot of people see that book as a pivotal event. And with that, I'd like to invite Joshua Blakeney to come forward and provide some personal introduction to Tony. And Joshua is Tony's graduate student. He's working towards a master's of arts degree in the direction of Colonization. So Joshua.
Political analyses, rather than rising above the contrived Islamophobic hysteria of the corporate media. While we are still waiting for a global corporate media, one propaganda meme of the corporate media, which is implicitly debunked in Professor Hall's globalization studies classes, is the notion that somehow one is anti-globalization if they oppose the globalization of poverty, exploitation, and corporate colonialism. Professor Hall, you're a conspiracy theorist, sir.
The National Post and putting us in the news, and I'd have to say that Joshua is definitely one of the most quoted individuals on campus here.
Around the 2007-2008 period, Professor Hall and I discussed at length the burgeoning academic field of 9/11 studies. After consulting with some of the vast body of literature authored by Professors David Ray Griffin, Peter Dale Scott, Nafiz Ahmed, Michel Chossudovsky, John McMurtry, Graham McQueen, Stephen Jones, Michael Kiefer, Niels Harrod, Richard B. Lee, Richard Falk and others, we concurred that 9/11 studies was worthy of our collective and individual attention. Rather than rely on intuition, as most do when it comes to 9/11, Professor Hall did what academics are supposed to do, which is do the reading of the peer-reviewed scholarship on the subject and draw his conclusions based on the empirical evidence. Anyone who has undertaken this intellectual exercise cannot help but notice the surprising dearth of any scholarly defenses of the official story of 9/11. I think it was therefore both brave...
The CIA and the FBI and the KGB and Castro and everybody was in on it. They met at Madison Square Garden to get their story straight one night to figure out this assassination. Same thing with 9/11. You know, there's so many people that would have to...
It's discrediting. It's a shame and a disgrace to the academy, to the university, and and to your colleague, David Ray Griffin, who you haven't obviously read. So
I think it was therefore both brave and honest of Professor Hall to dedicate a substantial part of Chapter 13 in Earth into Property to acknowledging the substantial body of scholarship which brings into question the official narrative of what transpired on September the 11th, 2001. Professor Hall contemplates on page 647 the terrible possibility that the Twin Towers were felled in order to provide the central spectacle in the most audacious and dramatic psychological operation of all time. He contends that on 9/11 the shock doctrine's application to the transformative workings of disaster capitalism, terror capitalism, reached new frontiers of social impact. Professor Hall has thus distinguished himself from the majority of his peers who have for one reason or another failed to comprehend the vast body of literature helping to distinguish fact from fiction vis-a-vis 9/11. I think it would not be a stretch to assert that most academics have found it better for their careers to regurgitate and thus lend credence to the implausible and wholly unsubstantiated state-sponsored interpretation provided within hours of this tragic event of 9/11. Professor Hall has characterized this complacency, which is often politically motivated, as a great failure of the academy. Despite the
In Earth into Property, I characterize the 9/11 wars as extensions of the Indian Wars in North America. This process of westward expansion continued in the American annexation of Hawaii and then the Philippines. Under the cover of the Cold War, this process of imperial globalization continued in the assaults on the lands and resources of indigenous peoples throughout Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The violence that's been so integral to the growth of the formal and informal American empire has been expressed in the local history of the region where I wrote The Bowl with One Spoon.
This land where I'm standing right now was part of one of the most audacious and vast land grabs in all of human history. In 1670, this valley became part of the territory granted without Indian consent to the Hudson's Bay Company. The English king created this fur trading enterprise with the aim of doing business with the indigenous peoples throughout the northern half of North America. 2 centuries later, the architects of British North America attempted to modernize this imperial realm by attaching British Columbia and the lands of the Hudson's Bay Company to the newly created Dominion of Canada. The building of a Canadian Pacific Railway was to provide the primary medium of communication to realize this ambitious plan. Some of the pioneers of the nascent American Empire opposed this agenda of transcontinental transformation. The Blackfoot people were caught between the competing territorial claims of the Old World Empire of Great Britain and the New World Empire of the United States. As detailed in Earth into Property, the treatment of Indians on the frontiers of US power foreshadowed the fate awaiting many indigenous peoples throughout the world. From the mining regions of the Congo to the oil fields of Eurasia, they would be subjected to terrible depredations on one resource frontier after the next. All over Lethbridge, you see regular invocations of Fort Whoop Up, Whoop Up Country, Whoop Up Drive, Whoop Up Days, and the Whoop Up Trail. Shortly after the sale in 1869 of the Hudson's Bay Company lands to the Dominion of Canada, Fort Whoop Up was established as an American whiskey trading post to the Blackfoot Indians. In the days before the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway, the American whiskey traders moved northward from Fort Benton, Montana, into the soft and undefended underbelly of British North America. Blackfoot Indians, including the Bloods, the Piegan, and the Siksika, served up great quantities of buffalo hides in exchange for sometimes lethal portions of high-octane alcohol. The notorious trade emporium took its name from the drunken chaos that once seemed to herald the American appropriation of Whoop-Up country. Fort Kip, Fort Standoff, and Fort Slideout were other American whiskey posts in the part of Blackfoot country where the Hudson's Bay Company formed the basis of British claims. Fort McLeod was built just upstream from Fort Whoop-Up on the river of Napi, the Blackfoot word for old man. Fort McLeod was constructed to house those members of the Northwest Mounted Police charged to eject the American whiskey traders from Blackfoot country and from British North America. The Mounties were created by the Dominion of Canada to enforce British law on the most parasitical and exploitative of the American whiskey traders. When the dust finally settled in 1877, Red Crow and Crowfoot joined Colonel MacLeod in Treaty 7. Treaty 7 confirmed the Blackfoot Confederacy's alliance with the Imperial Crown of the United Kingdom. Moreover, Treaty 7 opened the door to the Dominion of Canada as the primary colonizer of North America's remaining Northwest territories.
About 2 years ago, I came to Calgary and I tried to arrest George Bush for war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Whoa, whoa, hey! You arrest George Bush, that means arrest George Bush, that means
Loved ones lightly. Fueled by an awareness of the synthetic nature of the global war on terror, Professor Hall was instrumental in creating the intellectual framework for our attempts to get Canadian law enforcement officials to arrest credibly accused war criminal George W. Bush when he visited Canada in his first visit to a foreign country without diplomatic immunity in March 2009. Professor Hall's influential essay, Bush League Justice, Should George W. Bush Be Arrested in Calgary, Alberta, to be Tried for International Crimes, which went viral on the internet. That essay by Professor Hall was admitted as evidence during a court case which Professor Hall, Mohawk activist Splitting the Sky, former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark, and former U.S. Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney, our friends, and myself participated in at the Calgary Court Centre last year. This, as the uncensored media outside of Canada noted, was the first instance in the world of evidence being admitted to a court pertaining to the illegality of the actions of former U.S. Commander-in-Chief George W. Bush.
On March 17th, which just happens to be my birthday, Splitting the Sky gave me a present. He was arrested in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, where he tried to serve a citizen's warrant for the arrest of President George W. Bush, who had been invited to Canada to give a speech.
Afghanistan, those 1 in 3 Canadians who are also 9/11 skeptics now perceive the University of Lethbridge to be an academic institution that respects intellectual freedom, makes room for politically inconvenient truth, and protects its scholars from the kind of McCarthy-esque witch hunts which some of Professor Hall's colleagues have been victims of in the United States of America.
I think you could get a sense of it hearing Joshua. It turns out that the University of Lethbridge has given me a lot of space to think through things, to talk through things, to say things that some people might be shocked when they first hear. It has indeed been a place that I can attest generates the atmosphere where academic freedom is respected.